Marcus Reed, a wealthy black CEO, faces a terrifying and unjust encounter when he's wrongfully arrested by a racist mayor who assumes Marcus's identity as a threat due to his race. Despite being a respected figure, Marcus is profiled and treated as a criminal, exposing the systemic racism and abuse of power that plagues the system. His calm resolve in the face of this prejudice underscores the emotional and moral stakes, highlighting how deeply embedded racial biases affect even those who are powerful and accomplished. The crisp morning air outside the window was a reminder that, while the city was still waking up, Alex Devereaux had long been on the move. A towering figure in the corporate world, his influence stretched far beyond the walls of his office building. At 42, Alex had achieved everything he had ever dreamed of. CEO of a multi-million-dollar tech company. His name was synonymous with innovation and success. He had the sharp suits, the expensive watch, the sleek sports car, and a penthouse suite overlooking the skyline. But there was one thing that Alex Devereaux wasn't willing to let the world see: the pressure that came with it all. Despite the financial success and prestige, Alex still lived a life that felt small in some ways. He woke up early, worked long hours, and even now, as he stood in front of his bathroom mirror, he caught his reflection and the sharp lines of his face that had only deepened with time. His dark brown skin, an inheritance from his Haitian father, gleamed under the bathroom lights. It wasn't the wealth that Alex cared about most, but the freedom to use it to create opportunities, to lift up people who, like him, had been overlooked. Today, like most days, Alex would be in a small town meeting with local schools, offering scholarships for the underprivileged. The business meetings, the conference calls, the reports, those were routine. But today was about something different. It was about a personal project of his, a scholarship fund aimed at giving kids from neighborhoods like his a chance at something better. His father had worked long hours as a construction worker in Brooklyn, a hard-working man who'd taught Alex the value of resilience, the power of perseverance, and the importance of understanding where you came from. Alex had grown up in a modest brownstone in Brooklyn, with his father working tirelessly and his mother providing the emotional balance. It was here, in the hustle and bustle of city life, where Alex had learned to hold his head high, despite the many who doubted him because of the color of his skin. Today, his task was to get on the ground in a community that, in some ways, was just like the one he'd grown up in. Not that he had any illusions about what that meant. Even though he'd climbed the ranks of the business world, even though his accomplishments were broadcasted on news outlets and business magazines, he knew better than anyone else that being a black man at the top still invited scrutiny. The world hadn't quite caught up with him. Not fully. Arriving at the local diner, Alex felt that familiar sense of being underestimated. He was just about to open the door when a voice called out from behind him. "Can I help you, sir?" Alex turned to face the man behind the counter, a middle-aged white man with a pair of thick glasses perched on the tip of his nose. There was no hint of recognition in his eyes, no flicker of acknowledgement that Alex had once been on the cover of Forbes magazine, or that his company was currently valued at billions. "Just a coffee, please," Alex said, his voice warm but composed. The man eyed him for a moment, taking in Alex's dress, a tailored suit, the fine leather shoes, the sleek appearance, and then nodded. "Right," he said, giving a brief smile. "We're just about to open, so the kitchen's still a bit slow. I can get you that coffee, though." Alex smiled politely. "No problem, I'll wait." As he took a seat by the window, Alex watched the town slowly come to life. The sun was barely up, and the streets were still mostly empty. A few early birds were passing by, some in work clothes, others dressed casually. The faint scent of eggs and bacon wafted from the kitchen, but for Alex, this was more than just a breakfast stop. This was the place where his ideas that stemmed from years of navigating the barriers of race and class, would meet the reality of how far things still had to go. His eyes wandered out to the street, taking in the scenery, the gray sidewalks, and the old brick buildings. This small town was a far cry from the luxury of his penthouse, but it was real. There were no high-rise buildings or expensive cars here, but the people who lived in places like this were the ones who needed opportunities the most. The waitress, a young woman in her late 20s, came to his table with a warm smile. She placed the coffee in front of him, but as she did, she hesitated. You "You here on business?" she asked, her voice uncertain, as if she was still sizing him up. Alex took a slow sip of his coffee. "Yes," he said, his tone calm but purposeful. "I'm here to talk to the school about some programs we're funding, scholarships for kids who might not have the same opportunities." The woman nodded, though it was clear she hadn't fully understood. "That's nice of you." She gave him a polite smile before hurrying back behind the counter. Alex watched her go, a small sigh escaping his lips. The world had a funny way of making him feel invisible, despite the wealth and the success. And in a way, that had always been the case. Throughout his career, even as his company expanded and thrived, there was always a feeling of being looked at, but never truly seen. As if being black meant that his success didn't count as much as someone else's. He had learned to navigate those microaggressions, the looks, the questions about whether he was really in charge of his company, but it still stung. This town, for all its charm, was no different from the wider world that sometimes treated him like an outsider, a black outsider. The bell above the diner door jingled as a man in a jacket walked in, his brow furrowed as he made his way to the counter. Alex didn't pay him much attention until the man's eyes swept across the diner and then locked onto him. A flicker of recognition. The man's eyes narrowed slightly. "You look familiar," the man said after a beat, his voice low. "You from around here?" Alex smiled politely. "No, just passing through," he said, his voice even. The man tilted his head, then smiled back, though there was a certain hesitation in his expression. "Must have seen your face on the news then." Alex nodded. "I get that a lot." But the man didn't move on. Instead, he stepped closer to Alex's table, his expression shifting into something colder. "Must be nice," the man said, his voice taking on an edge. "Coming in here with all that money and power, and thinking you can make a difference." Alex raised an eyebrow, but didn't respond immediately. His hands remained steady on the table as he studied the man, sensing that the conversation was about to take a turn. The man, seeing Alex's calm demeanor, pressed on. "You know, people around here, they don't really trust folks like you. You got all that cash, but you don't know what it's like for people here. People who've been left behind." Alex took another sip of his coffee, his mind already processing how to handle this. "I understand more than you think," he said quietly. "I grew up in places like this. The only difference is, I had opportunities, most didn't. And now, I'm here trying to give some of those opportunities back." The man snorted, clearly not convinced. "Opportunities?" he repeated. "You really think your kind of help will change anything here? It's not that easy." Alex's eyes sharpened, his voice steady but firm. "No, it's not easy. But it's worth trying. Some things are worth fighting for." The man smirked and turned away, muttering under his breath as he moved toward the counter. Alex sat back, feeling the weight of the conversation settle in his chest. The words stung, yes, but they were nothing new. Every day, Alex fought against those assumptions. The belief that wealth and success meant distance from the struggles of others. He had seen how those assumptions played out in the world of business, in boardrooms, and on the streets. It was a constant battle to prove that his intentions were genuine, that his presence here in Thornhill wasn't just another attempt to erase the past, but to help write a better future. As the door jingled again, and the man left the diner, Alex leaned forward, tapping his fingers on the coffee cup. He had a long day ahead, but this interaction lingered in his mind. It was a reminder of the deep-rooted prejudices that would take more than money to fix. He could throw millions into scholarship funds, but it wouldn't mean a thing if the people around him couldn't see him for who he truly was. Alex took another sip, preparing himself for what lay ahead. The hum of the diner's fluorescent lights felt louder now, almost as though they were drawing attention to Alex's presence. He took another sip of his coffee, his thoughts a blur. The conversation with the man at the counter had unsettled him, but he refused to let it show. He'd grown up in places like this. His skin had always been a target for people like the man who'd just spoken to him. The difference now was that he didn't have to prove his worth to anyone, but for some reason, it felt like he still had to. A few minutes passed, and the diner seemed to settle into its normal rhythm. The waitress, who had been watching him earlier, returned with a refill on his coffee. "Anything else?" she asked, her tone polite but guarded. "No, I'm good," Alex said, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He could tell she was still sizing him up, still unsure of his place in the world, despite his suit and his presence. It was as if his clothes alone could speak louder than his achievements. The bell over the door jingled again, and a new customer walked in, a middle-aged man in a wrinkled t-shirt and cargo pants. He looked disheveled, but his presence immediately drew attention. The man approached the counter and ordered without a second glance, seemingly oblivious to Alex's presence. But it wasn't the man that caught Alex's attention. It was the way the waitress's demeanor shifted when she spoke to him. The politeness she had shown Alex moments before was gone, replaced with an ease that came from familiarity. She even laughed at his half-hearted jokes, something Alex hadn't gotten from her. Alex shifted in his seat, feeling the injustice of it sting again. It was subtle, this kind of bias, but it was there. And it wasn't new. He'd seen it all his life. The way people looked at him as if his success was somehow out of place because of the color of his skin, the way they assumed that, because he was black, he couldn't possibly be who he was. Alex's phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him from his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw a message from his assistant, Rhonda. "The meeting with the school district starts in 30 minutes. Are you still on track?" Alex quickly typed a response. "Yes, I'll be there, just finishing up here." He put his phone back into his pocket and stood up, straightening his jacket. The waitress glanced up from the counter, watching him, and this time, there was no warmth in her gaze. She had no idea who he was, and in this small town, it seemed he was still just another black man in a suit. As he turned to leave, the door jingled again, and a group of young men walked in. Their eyes swept the diner, and Alex felt the weight of their scrutiny immediately. They weren't looking at him the way they looked at everyone else in the room. Their gaze lingered, eyes narrowing in suspicion. He couldn't help but feel that they had already made up their minds about him, just like the officer from earlier. Alex held his ground, not letting the weight of their judgment show. He made his way to the door, each step heavier than the last. As he reached the threshold, one of the men made a pointed comment, loud enough for Alex to hear. "Don't know what that guy's doing here, looks like he's out of his league." The word stung, and Alex felt his hand ball into a fist, but he didn't respond. Instead, he took a deep breath and stepped outside. The air outside was cool, and it felt like a moment of respite, even if it was only temporary. He needed to let it go, but the feeling of being treated like an outsider, even here, was hard to shake. He walked down the street toward the local school district building. The sun had risen higher now, and the hustle of the day was beginning to take over. Alex's mind was still on the interactions in the diner. It wasn't about the small-town atmosphere, it was about how these small acts of prejudice added up over time, how they wore down your sense of self, no matter how many accomplishments you had under your belt. As he arrived at the school district building, Alex paused at the entrance. The world around him felt like it was closing in, and a small part of him questioned whether all of this was worth it. But then he thought about the kids who didn't have the opportunities he did, who didn't have the mentors to guide them, or the father who pushed them to be their best. That was the reason he was here. Inside the building, he was directed to the conference room where the meeting was being held. A long table stretched across the center of the room, surrounded by several officials, all of whom seemed to be waiting for him. As Alex entered, the murmur of conversation stopped, and all eyes turned toward him. His sharp suit and confident stride were supposed to command respect, but he could feel the hesitation in their gaze, the way their eyes darted quickly from his face to his clothes, as if they weren't sure whether he truly belonged. "Mr. Devereaux, we're glad you could join us," said the principal, a middle-aged woman with short-cropped hair and a tight smile. "We've been discussing how your company can help fund our scholarship programs." "Of course," Alex replied smoothly, keeping his tone professional but warm. "I believe it's crucial that we provide opportunities for young people, especially those who face systemic barriers." He took a seat at the table, trying not to feel the weight of their gazes on him. He'd worked too hard, built too much to feel small in a room like this, but the moment he began speaking, he saw their discomfort. They were listening, but not fully hearing him. It was as if they couldn't quite believe that someone like him, someone who seemed so polished, so well put together, could care about people like the students in this district. The assumptions were unspoken but clear. As the meeting progressed, Alex found himself growing more frustrated. Every suggestion he made was met with thinly veiled skepticism. The funding, the scholarship programs, everything was treated like it wasn't enough. They asked for more. Without acknowledging how much Alex had already offered, he could feel their judgment like a weight on his shoulders. Finally, the principal spoke up again, her voice tight. "Mr. Devereaux, while we appreciate the gesture, we believe that our district needs more than just financial support. We need someone who understands the culture of these communities." She glanced at him, then back at the others around the table. "I'm sure you understand what I mean." Alex's pulse quickened. He had heard this before, but that didn't make it any less frustrating. "I understand," he said, keeping his voice calm, though inside he was seething. "But I assure you, my company and I are fully committed to making real change. It's not just about handing out money, it's about creating long-term opportunities." The principal didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced at the other board members. The unspoken conversation between them was clear. Alex was black, and though his wealth was undeniable, he would always be an outsider in their eyes. He was the exception, not the rule. The tension in the room was palpable. Alex could feel it building, the weight of the assumptions and prejudices pressing in on him. His words, no matter how measured or calm, were being filtered through the lens of who they thought he was, not who he actually was. "I think we need to take a break," one of the other board members said, clearly sensing the shift in the conversation. "Let's reconvene in 20 minutes. Alex stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He felt his frustration boiling over, but he knew he couldn't let it show. Not yet. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As he stepped outside the conference room, he ran a hand through his hair, taking deep breaths. This wasn't just about the money or the scholarships, it was about proving that people like him could make a difference, despite the constant weight of bias. He had made it this far, and he wasn't about to let their doubts define him. But as he walked down the hallway, he felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. It was time to fight back. The air inside the school district building felt colder as Alex walked back to the conference room, his footsteps echoing on the linoleum floors. The break had been long enough for the board members to regroup, but Alex couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting was slipping away. Despite his calm composure, the words from the principal earlier still rang in his ears. "We need someone who understands the culture." The insinuation behind her words was clear. A black man like him couldn't truly understand the struggles of the very people he was trying to help. His phone buzzed again, and he took it out, trying to focus on the message. It was from Rhonda, his assistant. "Are you still good for the 3 p.m. meeting with the mayor?" He glanced at his watch. The time was slipping away, and his patience was wearing thin. But he couldn't afford to lose it. Not yet. His strategy was to remain calm, professional, but firm. If there was anything Alex had learned over the years, it was that he had to fight harder, make more sacrifices, just to be treated as an equal in spaces like this. He typed a quick response to Rhonda. "Yes, but I'm dealing with some complications here. I'll be there, don't worry." The door to the conference room opened just as he was tucking his phone back into his pocket. The principal stepped out first, her face still tight. She barely looked at him as she motioned for him to enter. The others were already seated, and Alex could feel their eyes on him. The moment he walked through the door, the energy shifted. There was no pretending. Now he could tell they were bracing for something, a challenge, a showdown. Whatever they thought was about to happen, Alex wasn't about to let them dictate the terms. He sat down, crossing his legs and folding his arms in front of him. His gaze swept over the room, meeting each person's eyes in turn. He was ready. "We've discussed your proposals," the principal began, her voice clipped. "And while we appreciate your contributions, there are concerns we need to address." Alex held back a sigh. He knew this was coming. The words didn't even matter. He could already guess what was about to happen. Another rejection. More backhanded compliments. More tokenism. The thought made his stomach twist. "I understand there are concerns," Alex said, his voice calm but firm. "But I think we should focus on the bigger picture. We can't continue to operate with these outdated systems, these biases that only serve to hold back our communities. If we want real change, it has to come from the top." One of the board members, a middle-aged man in a gray suit, shifted in his chair. "It's not that simple," he said, his voice too smooth, too practiced. "You can't expect us to just upend everything for one program. We have a lot to consider. A lot of people to answer to." Alex's pulse quickened, but he held his ground. He had been here before, in these rooms with people who claimed to have the power, but lacked the will to do anything meaningful with it. He had seen it all, heard the same tired arguments. "It's simple when you decide to act," Alex replied, his tone sharp, though controlled. "When you decide that kids, my kids, are worth more than the status quo." The room fell silent. He could see the shift. They were uncomfortable with his directness, with his challenge, but he wasn't going to back down. Not today, not ever. "I've spent years building my business, doing everything right," Alex continued, "and yet here I am, still fighting for my place at the table. It shouldn't be this way. Not for me, and certainly not for the kids in this district." The principal opened her mouth to speak, but Alex wasn't done. "You don't see me," he said quietly. "You see a black man in a suit, and that's all you need to make up your mind. You don't see the work I've done, the sacrifices I've made. You don't see the kids who are counting on you to do better." The principal's face flushed slightly, but she didn't respond. Alex wasn't looking for an apology. He wasn't even sure he wanted one. What he wanted was action. Real change. And if they weren't going to give it to him, he was prepared to take it by any means necessary. "I'm not here for you to tell me what I want to hear," Alex said. "I'm here to challenge you, to make you confront your own biases and your own failures. I'm here because I believe in these kids, and I believe in making this district a place where they can thrive." The room felt heavy with tension. His words hung in the air like a challenge, daring them to deny it. They couldn't argue with the truth, no matter how much they wanted to. The principal shifted in her chair, glancing at the others. "Mr. Devereaux, I don't think you understand the full scope of the situation," she said, though her voice was less certain now, less dismissive. "This isn't just about money. We're dealing with an entire community's worth of concerns. We can't just change everything based on one person's perspective." "I don't expect you to," Alex said. "But I do expect you to listen, to look past your assumptions. You think I'm here because of my money, but I'm here because of my commitment to these kids. I've been where they are. I know what it's like to fight for a seat at the table, and I'm not going to let you sit there and pretend everything is fine when it's not." There was a pause. A beat of silence that stretched on, pregnant with the weight of what Alex had just said. "You're right," one of the board members said finally, his voice slow. "We've failed, but I'm not sure this is the way to fix it." Alex leaned forward, his elbows on the table, eyes locked with the man's. "Then what is the way to fix it?" he asked. "Because from where I stand, you're doing nothing, and that's the real failure." The moment of confrontation was palpable, the tension thickening. The stakes were higher now. Alex could feel it. He had crossed a line. These people were uncomfortable. They didn't know how to respond to someone who was calling them out, someone who was forcing them to face the reality of their failure. But then, the door to the room opened, cutting through the standoff. One of the assistants entered, looking flustered. "Mr. Devereaux, the mayor is on the line," the assistant said, her voice hurried. "He says it's urgent." Alex glanced at the board members, all of whom were staring at him. It was a moment of defiance. It was a chance to show them that he wasn't just here to play nice, he was here to win, and he would fight for it. "I'll take the call," he said, standing up from the table. "But don't mistake this for weakness. This isn't over. Not by a long shot." He walked out of the conference room, the eyes of the board members burning into his back. It wasn't over. Not yet. The stakes were clear, but so was his resolve. He knew what was coming, and he was ready for it. Alex stood at the window of the small office, his eyes scanning the skyline as the tension within him threatened to spill over. The city stretched before him, a landscape filled with broken promises, unseen lives, and systems that seemed determined to keep people like him in check. He exhaled slowly, focusing on his next move. The conversation with the mayor had been a mixed bag, some promises, some backpedaling. The pressure from the school board was becoming unbearable. But Alex was determined to make a change, no matter what it cost him. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Rhonda. "Mayor's office just confirmed they're going public with their stance on the funding next week. I'll keep you updated." Alex read it, his eyes narrowing. Public. That word was like a double-edged sword. It could be a platform for the change he was hoping for. Or it could expose him and the whole initiative to the unforgiving glare of the public. He couldn't afford to back down, but the stakes had just been raised. He knew the system would fight back. It always did. He paced the room, the walls closing in on him, as his thoughts spiraled. Every step forward seemed to bring him closer to the edge. And yet, in the midst of all the frustration, there was something growing within him. A resolve. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the kids who'd been ignored for far too long. It was about forcing this system to reckon with its own failings. His mind went back to the board meeting. He knew the principal had been uncomfortable with his challenge, but it wasn't just her. There was a culture of complacency in that room. The system had gotten too comfortable in its ignorance. It needed to be shaken to its core. "Mr. Devereaux, you have a visitor." Rhonda's voice came through the intercom, snapping him out of his thoughts. "Send them in," Alex replied, keeping his tone even. Moments later, Mitchell, one of Alex's longtime allies and fellow advocates for change, entered the room. His face was tight with concern, his usual calm demeanor replaced with a barely contained anxiety. "Mitchell, what's wrong?" Alex asked, his voice laced with apprehension. "I've been getting some calls," Mitchell said, pacing slowly as he spoke. "There's movement on the other side. The school board has reached out to the city council. They're trying to shut you down, and there's talk about a special committee investigating your program. They're gunning for you, Alex." Alex's heart dropped. The walls, it seemed, were closing in faster than he could push back. He wasn't just up against the local school board anymore. The system had made its move. They were going to try to destroy everything he'd worked for. "Is there anything we can do?" Alex asked, his voice taut. His mind raced through every possibility, every maneuver. "I've contacted some of our legal advisors, and they're willing to help," Mitchell said. "But this is going to get messy and fast. We need to be ready for the fallout." Alex took a deep breath, absorbing the weight of what Mitchell was saying. He wasn't afraid. Not yet. But this was it. The moment he'd been working toward. The moment when the fight he had been preparing for would become real. If he wasn't careful, everything he'd built could come crumbling down. "I'm not going to sit back and let them control the narrative," Alex said, his voice steady. "They've underestimated me, they've underestimated what I can do, but I'm not going to back down. Not now." Mitchell nodded, his eyes full of admiration, but also concern. "I know you won't. But you've got to be careful. They'll stop at nothing to discredit you. This isn't just about you. It's about the entire system. The people who profit off of keeping things the way they are." Alex clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. "Let them come," he said, his voice full of determination. "I've been playing by their rules long enough. It's time we change the game." Mitchell paused, then stepped forward, placing a hand on Alex's shoulder. "Just remember, you don't have to do this alone. We're with you, I'm with you." "Thanks, Mitchell," Alex said, giving him a brief but grateful smile. "I know, but right now, we've got to focus. I need a game plan." The moment of solidarity passed quickly. The fight was no longer a distant possibility. It was here, and Alex needed to be ready. He stepped away from Mitchell, walking over to his desk and pulling up the school board's recent proposal on his computer. The plan they'd put forth was a watered-down version of everything he'd been advocating for. No real changes, no real commitments, just enough to quiet the community for a while. "Mitchell, I need everything on this board, all their connections, their donors, their personal interests. I want to know who's pulling the strings," Alex said, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "It's time to expose the system for what it really is." Mitchell's eyes narrowed. "You're going public with this, aren't you?" "I am," Alex replied without hesitation. "If they want to play dirty, we'll show them what real transparency looks like. It's time for them to see how deep the rot really goes." Mitchell nodded, his expression serious. "All right, I'll get on it." As Mitchell left, Alex leaned back in his chair, his thoughts swirling. He knew the stakes had just gotten higher. This wasn't just a fight for his program anymore. It was a fight for justice. A fight for the kids who were still being held back by systems that refused to see them for who they truly were. He had seen it in his own life, the way doors had been closed, the way he had to prove himself over and over again, just to be heard. He wasn't going to let that happen to anyone else. Not anymore. The next morning, things escalated quickly. Alex received word that a protest had started outside one of the local schools. It was organized by a group of parents who were frustrated by the slow progress of the district's programs. But when he saw the images on social media, angry faces, signs demanding accountability, he realized that something much larger was beginning to form. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about a community rising up, demanding real change. The school board had underestimated the power of the people they were ignoring, and now, that power was about to come crashing down on them. Alex stood up, his heart pounding. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't let the protest fizzle out. He had to lead it, control the narrative, and take the first steps toward accountability. "I'm going," Alex said to himself, his voice low but resolute. "It's time." The phone rang again, breaking the stillness in the room. It was Rhonda. "Alex, it's starting," Rhonda said, her voice urgent. "The mayor's office has officially announced their support for the board's proposal. They're framing it as a balanced approach. They're going to make it sound like you're the one being unreasonable. You need to act now." Alex closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the moment. The fight he'd prepared for was here, but now, it wasn't just about his work. It was about what kind of community they wanted to be. "I'm on my way," Alex said, his voice steady but filled with purpose. "Let's go show them how powerful the truth can be." Alex walked to the front of the podium with steady steps, the murmurs of the crowd in the packed auditorium growing louder as his presence filled the space. The room smelled of anticipation, thick with the heat of the emotions that had been building up for weeks. Activists, students, and parents had gathered for a community meeting that had been called in response to the latest school board proposals. A hollow compromise that ignored the core issues Alex had been fighting for. He wasn't just there as a speaker. He was there as a fighter, a man who had been dragged into a battle he didn't ask for, but was now determined to win. His fingers gripped the edge of the podium, his knuckles turning white as he focused on the faces before him. The people in the seats were looking for leadership. They were looking for someone who could stand up and say the things they were too afraid to. His eyes swept the room, meeting the gaze of several familiar faces. His old colleagues, friends, community leaders. And then, his eyes landed on his fiercest adversary, Mayor Randall Peters. The mayor was seated at the front of the room, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but Alex could feel the weight of the man's disapproval. Peters was a polished politician, always calculating, always prepared. But today, Alex had something he didn't. "Thank you all for being here today," Alex began, his voice strong and unwavering, despite the storm brewing inside him. "We've gathered to discuss something that affects every single one of us. What's happening in this room, in this school district, is not just an issue of education, it's a matter of justice." He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. The room grew quieter, hanging on to every syllable. "What we're up against is a system built to keep people like us down, people who have been pushed to the edges for too long, but I refuse to stand by and let this continue." Alex locked eyes with Peters. The mayor's brow furrowed slightly, his lips curling into a tight smile. Alex could feel the unspoken challenge between them. Peters stood up slowly, interrupting Alex's speech, his voice carrying a calm yet firm tone. "Mr. Devereaux, while I understand your passion, what you're proposing is not realistic. These are trying times, and we need solutions that can actually be implemented. Your radical approach is only going to cause more division, not less." Alex's chest tightened, but he remained composed. He had heard this line of thinking before. It was always the same. Don't rock the boat, don't upset the status quo. But Alex was no longer interested in the old ways of doing things. He wasn't going to play the game they wanted him to. Not this time. "Let me make this clear, Mayor Peters," Alex said, his voice ringing with authority. "What you're doing is not about solutions. It's about preserving the power of the few, while the many suffer. The people here today, the parents, the students, they're tired of being overlooked, and they're not going to be silenced any longer." There was a shift in the room. Whispers spread through the crowd as some of the attendees nodded in agreement. Alex could see the cracks in Peter's carefully constructed facade. The mayor's face flushed a deep shade of red, and for a moment, Alex thought the man might lash out. But instead, Peters took a step back and folded his arms even tighter across his chest, his eyes narrowing. "You think you're the only one who cares about this community?" Peters spat, his voice now laced with venom. "You think you're the only one who sees what's wrong? I'm here trying to make sure we all get a fair shot. But people like you—" He stopped himself, a grimace of frustration crossing his face. Alex's heart pounded in his chest. He had been waiting for this. He knew the mayor's true nature. He had seen it in the way Peters had treated every issue involving the marginalized, the poor, the people who didn't matter to the powers that be. Now, here it was, laid bare. "You're not here for the community, Mayor," Alex said, his voice rising with intensity. "You're here to protect your own interests. You're here to maintain a system that only serves people like you, people who are too afraid to acknowledge the power they have and the damage it causes. But that stops now. This is about real justice, real change, not the lies you've been feeding us." Peter's eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment, Alex thought the mayor might physically strike him, but instead, the mayor clenched his fists, shaking with rage, but his voice stayed steady, cold, and cutting. "You think this is about you, Alex?" Peters said, sneering. "You think you can come in here, change everything, just because you've got a platform? You don't get to dictate how this city runs. You're nothing but a disgruntled activist trying to make a name for yourself, and don't think I haven't noticed the way you've been stirring the pot, pushing the limits of what's acceptable." Alex stood tall, refusing to let the mayor's words rattle him. He had anticipated this. The accusation that he was just trying to make a name for himself, that he was stirring up trouble. It was the same argument they used every time someone tried to challenge the status quo. But Alex knew the truth. He wasn't here to make a name for himself. He was here to fight for the people who had been ignored for far too long. "Do you know why I'm standing here, Mayor?" Alex said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "It's because of the people you've forgotten. The children who walk into these schools every day, believing that they have no future. The families who are crushed under the weight of systemic inequality. I'm not here for me. I'm here for them." There was a long silence, the kind that stretched taut with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. The room seemed to hold its breath, but then the mayor broke it with a dismissive laugh, the sound full of disdain. "You're delusional if you think you can change anything. This system is too big, too entrenched. You're not going to break it, Alex. People like you are just a small thorn in its side. You're better off walking away before you make things worse." Alex felt the sting of those words, but deep down, he knew the truth. He was right. The system was big, it was powerful. And yes, it would try to crush him, just like it had crushed so many others, but he couldn't back down. Not now. "You're wrong, Mayor," Alex said, his voice unwavering. "I'm not going anywhere. And neither are the people who have been silenced for too long. I'm going to fight this until it's over, and I won't stop until you and everyone like you are held accountable." At that moment, a strange calmness settled over Alex. He had said what he needed to say, and there was no turning back now. He wasn't fighting just for himself. He was fighting for the future, for the kids who deserved better, for the families who couldn't afford to keep quiet anymore. He had no intention of walking away. But the confrontation wasn't over. Peters wasn't finished, and neither was the fight Alex had started. The mayor may have thought he had the power, but Alex had something even stronger, a community that was ready to rise up and demand change. Alex stepped back from the podium, meeting the mayor's glare with a look of fierce determination. The room was silent, but in that silence, there was something else, an electric charge, an energy that hummed through the crowd. They were watching, waiting, ready for the next move. But Alex knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. The room had quieted to an oppressive hush as Alex stood tall at the front of the community center. His chest rose and fell with a measured calm, but inside, his pulse pounded with the weight of everything he had just said to Mayor Peters. The crowd, a mixture of residents, parents, and local activists, had been waiting for this moment. The moment when someone would finally stand up to the corruption and systemic bias that had been suffocating them for years. Alex had no intention of letting them down. His words had hit the mayor hard, and Alex could see it in the twitch of Peter's jaw, the tightening of his fists. The mayor, usually so composed, now looked rattled. He took a step forward, his eyes narrowing, and for a moment, The tension between them felt almost tangible, like a storm cloud about to break. "You really think you can change this city?" Peters sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Do you think a few speeches and protests are going to fix everything? You've been stirring up trouble, and now you're making it personal. Don't you see what you're doing?" Alex's breath was steady, but his mind raced. He had spent his life navigating systems of power, but this was something different. This wasn't just about politics or policy. It was about a fight for justice that had been denied for far too long. And Mayor Peters, he was the embodiment of everything Alex was fighting against. "What I'm doing is fighting for what's right," Alex said, his voice unwavering, cutting through the air like a blade. "You think this is just about politics? About your reputation? No, it's about the people you've left behind. It's about the families who are struggling, the kids who are being crushed under a system that doesn't care about them. You've built your power on their backs, and I'm here to make sure that stops today." Peter's eyes flickered with something that wasn't quite fear, but more a flash of self-preservation. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, not in front of a room full of people. His grip on his armrest tightened, his knuckles pale, and he stepped closer to Alex, his breath hitching slightly. "You think you're the hero in this story? You're a nuisance, and don't think I won't have you put down. You're nothing without your community backing you up, and when that support dies down, what will you be left with, huh?" The anger in Alex's chest flared, but he refused to let it overtake him. He had fought his entire life against people like this, people who used their power to silence others. He wasn't about to back down now. "You think I'm nothing without my community?" Alex's voice was low, almost dangerous. "You have no idea what it means to stand with the people, to fight for them, not for your own interests. You've spent your career lying to them, telling them what they want to hear, while you've done nothing but preserve your own damn power. Well, no more." The room had fallen completely silent. The few whispers that had filled the space earlier were gone. Everyone was waiting for what would happen next. Peter's expression twisted into something dark, something malicious. He moved closer, his voice low, the words hissing out. "You think I'm the problem? You're the one who doesn't know when to stop, Alex. I've let you play your games, but you're crossing a line now. You don't get to dictate the rules, not in my city." And that was it. The moment Alex had been waiting for Peters had exposed his true colors. For all his polished speeches and public goodwill, it was all a facade. Underneath, there was nothing but a man terrified of losing control, desperate to keep his grip on the system that had elevated him while everyone else suffered. The mayor's words were more than just threats. They were an admission of guilt. He wasn't here to serve the people. He was here to maintain the status quo, at any cost. Alex's mind raced. He had planned for this moment, had known that the mayor would try to intimidate him, but now that the words were out in the open, Alex knew it was time to push further. He wasn't just fighting for the future of his community. He was fighting for every person who had been silenced, every child who had been denied opportunity, every family that had been overlooked. "You're not above the law, Mayor," Alex said, his voice firm, "and neither are the people who've been in power for far too long. The truth is out now, and no matter how hard you try to suppress it, it won't be buried again. Not this time." The mayor's eyes darkened, his lips curling into a bitter smile. "You think the law is on your side? I have connections. People who will back me up. You're just one man, Alex. One man against the system. You won't win." Alex's gaze never wavered. "I don't need to win alone. I have a community that's already standing with me. You're the one who's isolated, Peters. You're the one who's lost their trust." The room was electric now. The people in the audience were on edge, waiting to see what would happen next. Some were tense, others emboldened, and a few watched with disbelief, unsure of what they were witnessing. But they were all tuned in to this moment, the one that could change everything. Peters shifted his weight, looking over his shoulder as if to gather support from his allies in the back of the room. But the moment was lost. The crowd had already made up their minds. The mayor's empire was crumbling before his eyes. "You can stand there and spout all the idealistic nonsense you want," Peters said, his voice rising with frustration. "But the reality is, nothing changes. You're just like everyone else. You're part of the system you think you can tear down, Alex. And when it all falls apart, when you fail, I'll still be here. You won't be." Alex took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving the mayor's. "I'm not here to destroy, Peters. I'm here to build something better. And if that means tearing down the parts of this city that no longer work, then so be it." The silence was deafening. No one in the room spoke, but they were all listening. Then, as the mayor opened his mouth to respond, a loud bang echoed through the room, the sound of a door slamming open. The crowd turned to see a group of local activists filing in, led by Jasmine, Alex's close ally. Behind her stood a few familiar faces from the community, individuals who had been organizing for months, gathering support, and pushing back against Peters's proposals. They had come for Alex, to stand by him, to show him that he wasn't alone. Jasmine's eyes met Alex's. There was no need for words. Her presence was all he needed. She had his back, and so did everyone else in that room. "We're not here to play politics anymore," Jasmine called out, her voice loud and clear, cutting through the tension in the room. "We're here to make sure Alex's voice is heard, and if you're too blind to listen, then we'll make you hear us." Peter's gaze darted between Alex and the activists, now standing defiantly in the room. His face turned an alarming shade of red, his eyes flashing with rage. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. This wasn't just a public fight anymore, it was personal. And as Alex stood there, surrounded by the people who had chosen to fight with him, he knew one thing. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. But just as the mayor looked ready to lash out, a voice from the back of the room called out, "Enough, Mayor!" Everyone turned to see Chief Eleanor Ward stepping into the room, her uniform crisp, her expression stone cold. The mayor froze, caught off guard. Ward was the one person in the city who could challenge him. "You've let this go on long enough," Ward said, her voice calm but firm. "Alex is right. The system you've built is broken, and we can no longer ignore the damage it's caused." The mayor's mouth opened, but no words came out. The pressure in the room was suffocating now. He was trapped. Alex's heart raced, but he felt a sense of clarity that hadn't been there before. This was it. The turning point. The mayor was losing control, and Alex was ready to seize it. But just as the tension reached its peak, the room was filled with the sound of footsteps, the sound of someone coming. Someone who would tip the scales one way or the other. The tension in the community center remained palpable as Alex stood at the front, a feeling of finality hanging in the air. Chief Eleanor Ward had just stepped in, and the silence in the room felt like the calm before a storm. The mayor, Peters, seemed to shrink before her presence, the defiance he'd shown earlier dissipating. Alex could see it in the way he clenched his jaw, the way his hands trembled slightly. He wasn't in control anymore. "I don't need to explain myself to you," Peters said, trying to regain his composure, but his voice lacked the earlier conviction. It was weak now, brittle. "This is my city, I'll decide what happens." Ward didn't flinch. She stepped closer to him, and her voice rang out, steady and commanding. "No, Mayor, you don't. And I'm not going to stand by while you continue to destroy everything this city is supposed to stand for. Your days of manipulating this community are over." The crowd murmured, some cautiously, others with open relief. Alex could feel the shift, the power dynamics changing right before his eyes. It wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was the tipping point. "Alex has been right from the start," Ward continued, her eyes moving from the mayor to Alex. "You've used your office to push people down, and the consequences are too severe to ignore. This city deserves better." Peters's face flushed with anger, but it was clear. His game was up. The cracks in his facade were too large to repair. The crowd, once filled with apprehension, was now emboldened, and Alex's heart raced with the realization that this was the moment of change. In the back of the room, the activists and community members, once mere bystanders, now moved with purpose. Jasmine, the young woman who had been by Alex's side from the beginning, stepped forward. Her voice carried through the room with authority, a powerful contrast to the mayor's desperate bluster. "People in this city have been living in fear, and we've had enough," Jasmine said, her tone fierce and unrelenting. "We won't be silenced by people like you, Peters. You've underestimated us for far too long." The mayor's eyes darted toward the exits, but he wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not with Chief Ward standing between him and his escape. The room watched in stunned silence as Ward turned to address the crowd. Her presence had shifted everything. "We're going to do things differently now," Ward announced. "There will be an independent investigation into the corruption within City Hall. We will address the inequities that have plagued this community for years, and I'll make sure that those responsible are held accountable." The words echoed throughout the room, their weight sinking in. Peter's face drained of color as he realized the tide had turned, and he had no way out. This wasn't just a public reprimand. This was the beginning of a larger movement that would expose everything he had been hiding for years. Alex watched the shift take place, not just in Peter's, but in the crowd. People who had been skeptical, unsure of whether they could stand up against the system, were now looking at one another, empowered. They weren't alone. Alex wasn't alone. "Alex," Jasmine said softly, her voice carrying the respect and admiration that had grown between them in the months of activism. "We did it. This is just the beginning, but you've opened their eyes." Alex nodded, his heart still pounding. He had spent so long battling systemic injustice, questioning whether he was making a difference, but now it felt real. The victory wasn't just in the room with them, it was in the air, in the energy that was radiating from the people around him. The mayor was being exposed for the corrupt leader he was, and that couldn't be taken back. As the crowd erupted into applause, Alex felt a rush of emotion he hadn't expected. The struggle, the pain, and the doubt of the past month seemed to fade away. They had done it. They had turned the tide. But even as the applause washed over him, he knew this was only the beginning. The next few days were a blur of activity. The independent investigation Ward had promised was launched, and the community's demands for justice only grew louder. Protests filled the streets, and petitions circulated faster than anyone could keep up. But it wasn't just the momentum of the people. It was the media's attention. News outlets that had once been silent or complicit in Peter's reign were now covering the growing unrest, the exposure of the mayor's corruption, and the allegations that had surfaced. Alex spent his days meeting with reporters, speaking at rallies, and working alongside community leaders who were beginning to see the real potential for change. As the public outcry intensified, so did the pressure on Peters. The board meetings became heated, with calls for his resignation echoing from all sides. "I can't believe this is actually happening," Jasmine said one evening, sitting with Alex at a local cafe. The hum of the city outside seemed like a distant reminder of everything they had just started. Alex sipped his coffee, looking out the window. He had been here before, fighting, pushing for change, seeing the system buckle under pressure. But this felt different. The people had found their voice. They had found the courage to stand together. "This isn't over," Alex replied, his voice steady. "But we're not stopping. This city belongs to its people, not the corrupt few who've been running it for their own gain." Jasmine's eyes shone with determination. "We've got a long way to go, but at least we're not doing it alone." And that was the key, Alex thought. They had started something that couldn't be undone. The moment they had exposed the truth, the system had started to crack. They weren't just pushing for reform anymore, they were dismantling the structures that had allowed corruption and discrimination to thrive. As the weeks went on, the investigation into Peters's actions grew more damning. His connections with lobbyists, shady backroom deals, and the deep entrenchment of bias in his policies were uncovered piece by piece. It wasn't just the mayor anymore. His entire network of allies, including several council members, began to fall under scrutiny. The tides of power were shifting, and there was no going back. On the day the mayor was finally forced to resign, Alex stood in front of City Hall, a sense of accomplishment filling his chest. The activists, community leaders, and everyday citizens who had fought alongside him stood behind him, their voices ringing out in solidarity. But the true victory was in the realization that they hadn't just brought down one man, they had sparked something far bigger. "I can't believe it's over," Jasmine said, her voice full of awe. She stood beside Alex, both of them watching, as the mayor's resignation was broadcasted on every local news channel. "This is just the beginning," Alex said, his gaze resolute. "We've made a difference, but the work's far from over. We have to keep pushing for real change, systemic change." And he was right. The mayor was gone, but the system that had enabled him still needed to be dismantled. The fight for justice wasn't over, it was just beginning. The aftermath of the mayor's resignation sent shockwaves throughout the city. While the community had won a significant battle, the war for justice, equity, and real change continued. The independent investigations into corruption, police brutality, and systemic bias were only the beginning. Alex knew the path ahead would be long, but he was no longer walking it alone. He had learned invaluable lessons about resilience, about fighting for what was right, no matter the cost. And as he looked at the community he had helped mobilize, he knew they were stronger than ever. They had proven that when people come together, they can tear down even the most entrenched systems of power. But even as the victories mounted, Alex remained aware of the challenges ahead. The journey to true equality, to a city that truly served all its people, was far from over. Yet for the first time, Alex felt hope. The kind of hope that comes from knowing change is possible, that the fight for justice is worth every step. And so, with determination burning in his heart, Alex knew this was only the beginning. As Alex stood on the steps of City Hall, the weight of everything he had fought for over the past months seemed to settle in. The crowds were cheering, their voices rising in a chorus of triumph. The mayor was gone. The investigation into systemic corruption, racism, and abuse of power had started. But the city, for all its pain and disillusionment, was also healing. The moment felt like a victory. But not just for Alex. It was a victory for every person who had ever felt invisible, unheard, or oppressed by a system that was supposed to protect them. He had stepped into the battle with the belief that one voice, one movement, could make a difference. Now, standing in the wake of the victory, he knew the truth. Collective action, when fueled by courage and persistence, had the power to break even the strongest walls of corruption. It wasn't just the mayor's resignation that made this moment so monumental. It was the realization that the fight was far bigger than one man. It was the acknowledgement that the systems that perpetuated inequality, whether it was racism, systemic abuse of power, or economic oppression, were being challenged. People had stood up, spoken out, and taken a stand. And now, the very foundation of those entrenched powers was shaking. Alex's growth throughout the story was profound. He had entered the fight feeling alone, unsure if his efforts could ever lead to change. He had faced moments of doubt, frustration, and exhaustion, but as he watched the people of the community, who had once been hesitant and fearful, now emboldened and ready to rise together, he understood the true power of resilience. It wasn't just about the fight against one person, one corrupt leader. It was about the collective, about how each individual, no matter how small they might have once felt, could become part of a larger movement. He had learned not just about the strength of the community, but also about the resilience of the human spirit. He had been forced to confront his own doubts and fears, and in doing so, he had unlocked something deeper, an understanding that progress, no matter how hard won, was always possible. The system could be dismantled, not in one grand movement, but in a series of small, determined steps. Jasmine, who had been by his side throughout the entire journey, stood next to him. Now her eyes were bright, filled with admiration and pride. She had seen the transformation in Alex, from a man unsure of his place in the fight, to a leader who had sparked change. Together, they had navigated the treacherous waters of resistance, their shared vision making them stronger as they faced the monumental task ahead. "You did it," Jasmine said quietly, her voice tinged with awe. "You showed everyone that it's not just about fighting the system. It's about becoming the system making the change, not waiting for it." Alex nodded, looking out at the crowd. He had not fought for recognition, nor had he sought fame. But the faces before him, those who had marched alongside him, stood up at the town meetings, and shared their stories of injustice, reminded him why he had started this journey. It was about the people, not the accolades. "I didn't do it alone," Alex replied. "It was all of us. This is just the beginning." As the crowd began to disperse, their energy still buzzing with hope, Alex and Jasmine walked down the steps. The sense of accomplishment was undeniable, but Alex knew the work wasn't done. The mayor's resignation was one victory, but the real change would come when they began to heal the city itself, the systems that had been corrupted, the lives that had been broken. In the days that followed, Alex continued to work alongside Chief Ward and the community leaders, pushing for the systemic changes that were now so urgently needed. The investigations were underway, but the call for police reform, for economic justice, for the dismantling of the biases that had been woven into the fabric of society, was just as critical. It was not enough to remove one man from power. The system itself had to change. Ward implemented the reforms she had promised: mandatory bias training for officers, stronger oversight, and an open-door policy for the community to voice concerns. It was a long-term commitment, one that required vigilance and dedication, but it was a step forward. As the city began to rebuild itself, Alex couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope for what was to come. But hope wasn't just a passive feeling. It was an active, relentless pursuit. Alex knew that he couldn't afford to rest on his laurels. Now he had seen the impact one person could make, but he had also seen how fragile that impact could be if people didn't continue to push for justice. His work, however, didn't stop in the confines of his city. He began to take his message further, speaking at forums and events about the intersection of race, power, and accountability. His words resonated with so many, especially the younger generation who had been inspired by the movement he had sparked. They, too, were realizing that they weren't powerless. They could stand up. They could demand change. Alex had started this fight as one man, but by the time the dust began to settle, he was part of a much larger movement, and that movement had the potential to ripple through every corner of society. His story, his struggle, was a testament to the idea that change is always possible, no matter how difficult or insurmountable it might seem at first. Yet, even as the victories piled up, Alex remained vigilant. The battle was far from over. Racism, corruption, and abuse of power were still very real, systemic issues that required constant attention. And for as much progress as had been made in the city, Alex knew that the fight wasn't just local. It was national. There were still so many communities, so many people suffering, many whose stories had yet to be heard. But there was something different now. The fight wasn't just about the battle in front of them, it was about the future. Alex had no illusions about the challenges ahead, but he also had faith. Faith in the people around him, in their collective strength, and in their shared resolve. They had already made change possible. And so, as he continued to speak out, to fight, and to lead, Alex's message to the world was clear. Change doesn't come easily, but it is always worth the fight. And every step forward, no matter how small, is progress. His story was just one of many, but it was a story that echoed the collective struggle for justice. The victory over Peters was not a final destination, it was a beginning. And Alex knew that the journey was just as important as the destination. It was a journey toward a world where justice, equality, and fairness weren't just ideals, but lived realities for everyone, no matter their race, background, or station in life. As the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place and the city began to rebuild, Alex's thoughts turned to the future. His work was far from done. There would be more battles to fight, more corrupt systems to dismantle, more injustices to expose. But for now, Alex could rest easy, knowing that he had played a part in changing the course of history, and that his journey, though long, was one that would continue, fueled by the hope and strength of the people he had inspired.